I'm pleased to be joined today by Dr. Valerie van Mulukom. She is an assistant professor at Coventry University's Center for Trust, Peace, and Social Relations, and a research associate at the University of Oxford's Center for the Study of Social Cohesion. Her research spans a broad range of topics roughly unified within the cognitive and evolutionary science of imagination, memory, and belief. Valerie, welcome to the Nature and Nurture podcast.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. So imagination, memory, and belief. There's a lot there. Where do you want to start?
Yeah. Where do I want to start? Basically, so it kind of what I've been finding intriguing about my research is that it does sound like a well, it is a very broad area of research, right? But I'm starting to see ways in which these things like connect, sometimes unexpectedly and sometimes more straightforwardly. And I do really enjoy that. And I've been trying to get more of a focus that people know what I'm doing, but that's I'm slow. I'm hoping I'm slowly getting there.
How does the evolutionary focus come into these topics?
Right. I suppose so. Memory and imagination are cognitive abilities, whereas belief can maybe be better understood as sort of a product or an effect. So in that sense, I have at some point suggested that uh, the cognitive process of imagination and the mechanisms that are included therein, such as theory of mind or that sort of thing, are required for belief to happen. So,
Mm-hmm.
and in the same way that we need memory to construct certain narratives which then support beliefs. So,
Mm-hmm.
in that sense, thinking about how memory and imagination work can tell us something, and how they, and in what kind of different uh, not just it's not necessarily how they work cognitively, but okay, skip. Wait, let me rephrase that. So if we think about how I know what I want to say, but like configurations, that was the word I was looking for. Right.
Mm-hmm.
So if we think about the different ways in which memory and imagination work and the different configurations that they can take, so what types of memories we have, what type of imaginings, then that can tell us something about the narratives that can come out of that and the beliefs that can come out of that,
Mm-hmm.
if that makes sense.
So when we're talking about belief, are we talking about very simple fact-based beliefs like I believe this water is safe to drink? Or are we talking more broadly about like abstract types of beliefs about more artistic things or
Yeah, I personally have only ever looked at belief, sort of higher level beliefs, if you will. So things like supernatural belief or worldview beliefs, not necessarily supernatural, but things like I believe
Mhm.
that science is the best way of gaining knowledge, or I believe that the universe is random,
Mhm.
or that there is a God.
Uh-huh. So here's two ideas that might be a contentious topic in your field. I
Mhm.
imagine there are some people who might argue something like um, people don't necessarily need to have worldviews like these. And as you reach like a high enough level of cognitive capacity, then maybe you can start to devote extra energy to constructing a worldview, whether that's scientific or religious. And then other people, I imagine, might say something like, by default, we have to do this, and the only thing that changes is what the worldview looks like.
So, coming from the memory research background, I would argue that no. Well, I would suggest, or my line of thinking would be that yes, we do need something like that. It might not always be fully explicit and obvious to ourselves, but I think we do all have some kind of worldview, and it's also not static, right? This can change. And what I'm linking it to in my head is identity. So we all, research shows that that having an identity of some sort is associated with psychological well-being. So thinking of yourself uh, as a mother, as a scientist, just
Mhm.
two examples there, and um, and the narrative that you build around that. I think of myself as a scientist because I do such and such work. I think of myself as a good mother because I have done so and so. If you can construct, if you have that identity in your head and the narratives you built around it, if having such a narrative is associated with psychological well-being, even if that narrative can easily shift, right? So we change our identities over the years, even if we don't notice it, you
Uh-huh.
know. Um, and in the same way, I'm thinking that if you don't have a worldview at all, like even if the worldview is something like everything's random, like nihilistic, right? Like, oh, there is no intrinsic meaning in the world. That sounds like, oh, there is no worldview. No, but the worldview is the fact that you think there is no meaning. I think having that in itself is what what we all, need. I think,
Mhm.
yeah, if you think about, this, identity disorders, it's an absence or a fragmented identity, which is associated, which is just something which leads to issues. So it would be my hunch that we all need, you know, identities. They don't have to be fully fledged, and we don't have to be consciously aware of all the opinions that we have, I think. But having a coherent identity and in by extension worldview
Mhm.
is, I think, beneficial and something that humans need.
That seems to map nicely onto Piaget's, the famous developmental psychologist, his idea that like children learn through games and through play. So when you adopt an identity, I guess you're learning the implicit rule structure of the society around you, almost if you treat it kind of like a game.
Yeah, I just reviewed two articles about exactly this yesterday,
Cool.
uh, which suggests that which we're looking at, you know, how play helps us learn about social interactions, and
Hmm.
then it looked at um, video game play in, various disorders to do with social cognition. So autism on the one side of the spectrum, and then schizotypy on the other. And the other paper was about role-playing games. So
Hmm.
that suggested that we think that childhood pretend play is, something that children do to learn how to interact with the world, which it is, obviously.
Hmm.
But adults do this too. So adults can engage in role-playing games, and there's also this contributes to group identity, social interaction, and all that sort of thing.
Uh-huh. Do you do any
Hmm.
developmental research yourself?
I do not know. No.
Okay.
No.
I do still wanted to ask the question, but we can preface it by
Mhm.
saying like this is more just speculation. What do you think it does to children to have structured versus unstructured play? So we're on one hand, especially if we're looking like in our evolutionary past, you kind of just have to pick up a stick and maybe it's a sword, maybe it's a wand. Like you have to use your imagination a lot more. And then nowadays you have like toy kits and it almost tells you what to do. So I'm wondering if that might shape your thinking in a more constrained way.
Hmm. I I, I have some thoughts about this. Well, so I used to think something similar. I used to think that about television. So if we
Mm-hmm.
watch TV instead of reading books, then the narrative, the images is all there, right? We don't have to do anything.
Mm-hmm.
But coming back to your question, I wonder, so one way in which children still have to use their imagination is through storytelling. So when they
Mm-hmm.
have, I think well, typically developing children, I think, come up with little stories
Uh-huh.
themselves, even if, my daughter has a Frozen set with like, but she comes up with little stories like, oh, she needs a cape because she is cold or something.
Uh-huh.
Um, And is so I suppose I'm questioning both sides. I'm thinking, even if you have a stick, I think there will be rules, because there are certain
Mhm.
rules of how you interact with other people, and everyone knows not everything goes. You can't say, "Look, I've got the stick and it's water." Like, what? No, you can pretend it's like a doll or a. There's still rules, I think. And on the other hand, I think children still have plenty of unstructured play that we might not
Yeah.
necessarily see. But yeah, no idea what the actual effects are, or the proportion of types of toys available.
Yeah. Well, an interesting hypothesis to test for a developmental psychologist out there might be whether children optimize the rigidity and fluidity of their play. So, for example, maybe if you only have sticks to play with, you have to adopt sort of a very rigid story, specifically just because it's harder to imagine that when there's so much freedom. And then maybe on the other extreme, if you have, like, let's say you have a playroom and there's specific outfits. So you know you have to be a cowboy because that's the only thing you can get dressed up as. But maybe you can add the dimension of being a space cowboy. So you let the narrative expand a lot more to accommodate the additional rigidity of the things you're playing with.
Hmm? Yeah.
So did you start off in a more traditionally cognitive sense, researching memory and imagination? And then
Yeah. Yeah.
uh,
So my PhD was on the cognitive neuroscience of imagination, where I worked with Donna Rose Edis and Mike Corbelis, late Mike Corbelis. He we we tried to figure out the role of the hippocampus when we imagine future events. So, for example, oh, I've got a job interview next week, and then I'm trying to think, who will be there, what will it look like, how will the room be. We like generate
uh,
these scenarios in our head, right? So basically that,
so this is like
because
functional imagination rather than like space cowboy imagination.
um, I suppose so. But it's so the hypothesis was that the type of imagination we looked at, future event imagination, is based on episodic memory, so our memory for personal experiences rather than for facts and so on, like semantic memory. And the idea is that when we imagine novel events, such as future events, we use our memory for past experiences and combine memory details in a new way to generate these novel events. So any event that happens in the future will never be identical to the one in the past, right? So for
Mhm.
that reason, you have to come up with something that's completely new. But we also don't know whether that's necessarily going to happen.
Mhm.
And we can combine memory details from our past in a way that we know will never happen. Uh, so in that sense, the hypothesis was that the imagination that we do, imagining, sorry, that we do when we imagine future events is not distinct necessarily from, let's say, fantastical imagining, like you say, like
Mhm.
uh, being space cowboys in the future. Um, Although, there's actually researchers sort of lacking in that respect. Last time I checked, I,
Mhm. Have you heard of
happy to
the
stand corrected.
auditory cheesecake metaphor with respect to music?
The auditory cheesecake. Oh, is that to do with the evolutionary? Tell me.
Steven Pinker posed this, a psycholinguist. So he was basically making the argument that we didn't evolve for music specifically, we evolved for language, and music was like an artistic byproduct of that. Just like we evolved to like fat and sugar, not cheesecake specifically, but we like cheesecake because we like fat and sugar. So I'm wondering if, in this sense, that the more artistic imagination is like a byproduct of imagination. So like there's two ways you could define imagination, I guess. There's imagination as basically simulating a hypothetical future that you're about to enter, and that would have clear survival advantages. And then there's the imagination in the sense of like imagining something that might never exist and might never help you, but it's fun.
Yeah. Uh, Actually, so Yeah, that might well be true. I personally don't believe that the arts is a byproduct, and I'm working on research on exactly that, where I try to show that the arts, like religion, actually are symbolic systems.
Hmm.
So, what I mean with that is that when we think, so they seem frivolous, right? Music, a painting, sure, it might mean something, but it's not gonna like, it's not a solar panel. It's not gonna, it's not, we're not growing crops here. The note fact. But what I'm suggesting is that what arts and religion are really good at is producing symbols that stand for beliefs, feelings, and experiences. And they give answers not to factual questions like, is the sun at the center of our solar system? The hint is in the name. But can it answer questions like, why are we here? How do I live together with other people?
Hmm.
So it's questions that science may be less equipped, not necessarily unequipped, right, but less equipped at answering. So basically, questions to do with the human experience specifically, like how
Hmm.
humans experience the world. And so the way arts and religion might do that is by the products that they generate. So religion has rituals that we go through that
Hmm.
then evoke experiences in us, and that can then um, consolidate beliefs.
Hmm.
If you feel the presence of God through a religious ritual that you're attending, that, for example, could consolidate your belief in God, or maintain it. And that's sort of the idea.
Yeah.
Mm.
There seems to be a point at which those more subjective and objective truths meet, because you could have a more cynical perspective saying something like, you're just constructing these beliefs in order to alleviate death anxiety or get rid of feelings of nihilism because you want to feel like there's a purpose. And then you can say, okay, maybe that's true, but to the extent it's true, some worldviews are going to be better at doing that than others. So even there's kind of this meta truth of how successful that worldview is at giving you meaning, and then that seems to be sort of a meta meaning on its own.
Yeah, I yeah, I think so one of my other research project looks at secular beliefs, and it suggests that I mentioned this briefly before, that we tend to think, for example, of atheists as people who simply believe in God, and you can think of nihilists as people who don't have beliefs. But I don't think that's true. I think that both atheists and nihilists still have ontological beliefs and ethical beliefs and
Mhm.
ideas of what the world is. It's just that they are nihilistic or
Uh-huh.
atheist. And um, in the research that we did, we asked 1,000 people from 10 countries around the world, although predominantly Western, right? I won't. Um, what they believe in if they don't believe in God. And the way I phrased it a bit awkwardly that way, people, accused me of having a religious agenda, which I didn't. But what I wanted to get at was like, what are your sort of core beliefs about the big questions? And what we found was that there were really interesting categories. So most people mentioned that they believe in science and scientific methods, which might be because we mostly ended up asking atheists what they believed in. Um, but also people said they believe in kindness, in equality for all people, in, just living your life to the max, considering we only have one life, that sort of beliefs. So there was what I'm trying to say is there was a
Uh-huh.
whole range of beliefs, even even in people who said they don't have beliefs, some of whom said, oh, I don't have beliefs. Well, you do. We just It's the word
Uh-huh.
belief that maybe uh has some connotation, so I've started
Right.
switching to worldview instead, which seems more acceptable.
Uh-huh. It's kind of like a chicken and egg problem, because you can have religious believers look at atheists with values like that and say, oh, you believe in truth and goodness, so you still have this sort of more metaphysical worldview. you just don't realize it. And then the atheist might look at that and say something like, no, truth and goodness exist outside of any particular religious framework. And it's either way, it does seem to be a metaphysical belief, but you can't know whether
Hmm.
that's whether like religion emerges because that sort of exists as a natural law type thing, or whether that exists as a natural law type thing because some framework might explain it in a particular way.
Mm, I think religion is really good. Religions are really good at providing people with a set of coherent metaphysical, well, mostly coherent metaphysical ideas. And because you're often taught religion by first by your parents and then religious authorities and so on, other
Mhm.
people around you, it, it's easy to then take it on board, and you can later adjust your beliefs and so on. So I think in that sense that it's it seems as it yeah so I can see
Mhm.
how that seems like a chicken and egg problem. uh what I'm trying to say is I think in the absence of religion people still come up with their own metaphysical
Mhm.
views. It's just that if religion is there, it's just
Uh-huh.
you know often
Right.
ready packaged.
So if
So
it, I guess it depends how we're defining religion, because if we say we're defining religion as like an organized set of doctrines that are already exist, then there's a finite number of religions. But then if you more broadly say something like religious belief is any belief that has these axiomatic metaphysical presuppositions that you have to make almost based on faith, because you can't necessarily prove um, what goodness is, for example, then it starts to approximate religious belief, but I guess it depends on how comfortable you are using that term.
yeah, I'm cognizant of religions that don't focus so much on belief at all,
Mhm.
and focus more on practices, especially I, as far as I'm aware, in the more in the East, if we can say that. Um, so I wouldn't, we have to be aware of not, um, what do you call it? Of not,
Some sort of
we have to be aware. Yeah, I'm trying to form. We have to be aware that we might um go wrong, let's say, and think of religion as one of the world religions, which are predominantly Abrahamic,
Mhm.
and then think of religion in a very specific way, even though there are many religions around the world which don't
Uh-huh.
work in the same Abrahamic way. So,
Right.
yeah, that's what I
Uh-huh.
would say
So
about
there are natural or cultural selection processes happening on religion, right? Because you could invent a religion every day, and I'm sure people do, but most of them die out and they don't spread. And then the ones that have lasted thousands of years probably share some traits in common that have allowed them to propagate.
Oh yeah, I don't think I'll be able to comment on that just because that's such a you'd have to look at all the historical variables
Mhm.
and yeah. But what I am what I am interested in and what I'm researching is actually I just want a grant to look at atheism in the Nordic countries, so Scandinavia, but
Mhm.
more or less. And the idea is that we try and explain belief there, and we don't just try to explain the absence of God belief, but also the presence of other types of beliefs, like belief in science, let's say. And the idea is that it's not just the um, cognitive developments. So we go against the idea that once you have enough education, people will stop believing in God or something like that.
Mhm.
Instead, we're looking at cultural transmission. So how if if most people in a village, let's say, all believe one thing, you are more likely to believe that thing as well. If people who are prestigious all believe one thing, then you are more likely to imitate that as well. Um, and so we're trying to look at all these type of cultural learning transmissions, or like cultural learning biases. So look at how people are biased to learn from others and see
Hmm.
whether this influences what people believe in highly secular countries like in
Uh-huh.
the Nordic countries.
So for the most part, we're more likely to conform to the dominant group beliefs. But what happens when it's something like people ascribe almost a certain nobility to themselves for going against the norm? So whether that's
Mm.
like a minority religious community that's being persecuted, or even if it's just like a conspiracy belief, because I know you've done research
Mm.
on that as well. I imagine conspiracy thinking involves phrases like, everyone else is like just missing it, and I'm the one who figured it out. So there's this, maybe it's like an intellectual arrogance that misses that normal sort of pushing you towards whatever the rest of the group is doing.
So I was exactly, yeah, I was also thinking about conspiracy belief. So I'm working on that as well, but like very much a work in progress. So no results or anything like that. But I think the same biases are in effect there, but
Mhm.
not the bandwagon bias, not the bias that, oh, most people believe, because they, there is conspiracy belief is correlated with like feelings of uniqueness, well, narcissism as well, a few other things. So the need to feel unique, for example. So I think in those cases, it's more likely that it will be things like prestige bias. So people they hold in very high regard, whether they are that guy from Infowars or something like that,
Mhm.
will they're more likely to take information from people that they hold in high regard and less likely to take information from people they don't trust, like governments and scientists and so on.
Mhm.
So I think the idea is that, as with religious beliefs, they're different things, right? But in
Mhm.
some ways, they might work slightly in similar ways. So, like religious beliefs, my suggestion would be that conspiracy beliefs are not just, low levels of critical thinking or, low levels of education or anything like that. It's very much a social phenomenon as well, I think.
Mhm.
So we've already seen that it's highly correlated with trust in the government and the scientists, but also I think, and this is what I'm working on now, is like looking at these cultural learning biases. Like, who are they trusting information from, and why are they transmitting information as well? Why are they, sorry, like passing it on? So, for example, there's some reason to suggest that sometimes people pass on misinformation they know is untrue, but for their reputation. So they are,
Huh.
or maybe they don't know it's untrue, but they also don't know necessarily that it's true, but they pass it on to show, like, look, I'm someone who thinks these ideas, and
Mhm.
that can bolster reputation.
Uh-huh. Yeah, I guess it's more complicated because there are historical examples of there being that sort of singular figure who's a minority belief, like Galileo, for example, standing up against the dominant belief that
Mm.
the Earth was it Galileo? Is
Yeah,
the
yeah,
center
yeah. It was.
of the universe. Or even more recently, I guess, like people who a small minority of doctors who believe that smoking was actually bad for you, and then you have even the government saying, no, it's fine, and then later to reverse their position.
Yeah, I'm thinking about Jesus actually. That
Really?
was he was in a minority when he started. He was going against the local religion.
Uh-huh. Right. So
Uh,
there's some set of properties that sometimes allow these different beliefs to die out, and then other times for them to like
mm,
propagate madly. What do you think those properties are?
yeah, you asked me this early in the interview. You snuck it back in. I'm uh I'm uh I'm not sure, I mean, we can think about, so what makes certain religions more successful than others? I'm not sure.
And it doesn't have to be just religions, because we
But
could be talking about conspiracy belief or really any type of belief. Uh,
oh, right.
Maybe more subjective things though, because if we're talking about scientific belief, then ideally there's like fact checking, but if we're talking about a subjective thing, where one side could win depending on different properties an argument has.
Yeah, so some other work that I've been collaborating with others on is the cultural evolution of conspiracy beliefs. So why do certain conspiracy beliefs get believed? Conspiracy theories believed, but there others die out, which is basically actually what you're asking.
Mm-hmm.
And so, suggestion is that again, these cultural learning biases, they, have an influence. So if a theory gets endorsed by a celebrity, there we go, that's more likely to be passed on. But then on the other hand, we also have content biases. So, and this is from work in narrative research. So again, a link to memory, which is kind of nice. So certain narratives, like conspiracy theories, that have certain features are more likely to be remembered and transmitted. For example,
Mm-hmm.
Emotional narratives, uh, threatening narratives, narratives with negative emotional content. These are all things that grasp our attention and like are more likely to be remembered. And so if conspiracy theories have these, these sort of features, then that contributes to their longevity. And in part, I've wondered whether this is why scientific um, information and knowledge about COVID-19 is lost out against conspiracy theories. Conspiracy theories are just so much more appealing. They're like a scary science fiction novel or something like that. They're like, this is gonna happen and this and that and
Right.
lizards and I don't know.
Uh-huh. So
And
right,
then
so there's the negative parts like dragging you down if the worldview is true, but then there's also, I guess, it depends on how heavily you're gonna weight like feeling special and feeling like you're one of the few people who's figured it out in a world of
oh
chaos.
yeah,
Mhm.
yeah, I wonder whether that plays a really big role because like the world is not getting less complex, right? Like
Mhm.
we, as technology advances, we are, I think, less able to understand exactly how everything works. Like, would we
Mhm.
be able to, a single individual, would they be able to reproduce agriculture, to reproduce how to do electricity, all these
Uh-huh.
processes in our lives have become so far removed from us. And then suddenly, like this complex new phenomenon shows up, a new disease. Nobody knows how it works, what happens, consequences, but you figured it out,
Uh-huh.
right? There's suddenly you feel like you've got knowledge and you've done it. And it just happens so rarely. Like
Uh-huh.
one time I was describing how that might feel to someone who has conspiracy theories. And I realized it was just, I was describing how I feel when I do academic research. When you get a
Mhm.
solution to a problem that you've been struggling with and it seems really important, that's like solving a really complicated puzzle.
Right.
That's rewarding for sure. So I do get it. Like,
So I guess the often overlooked part about scientific training is it's not necessarily that we're training to come up with hypotheses. That's almost the natural fun part. We're training for years and years to throw away most of them based on based on finding every possible way you could falsify it. And only if you can't falsify it do you then accept it cautiously.
I mean, that's the idea, right? I don't know if we, science is fast these days. You need to have new publications, you need to new this, new that.
Mhm.
So I don't know if we stay with problems long enough, actually. I'd love to stay with one problem for longer, but you know, then a new thing pops up and I'm like, oh, that
Mhm.
sounds interesting. And then off
Yeah.
we go.
So you also do research at Oxford. Do you know Celia Hayes?
Well, yes, I know her work, but I don't know her personally, no.
She was one of my first guests on the podcast. She does a
Oh,
lot of work on cultural evolution and also imitation.
mhm.
And when you were talking about earlier the cognitive biases, like imitating a celebrity, for example, I was wondering to what extent imitation might be one of the means that propagates in imagination or belief or memory.
Hmm. Yeah, I don't know. I've always thought of imitation as sort of like it's more behavioral,
So
right?
this would
Because
be
like,
imitation in the evolutionary sense.
sorry, right. Okay, yeah, gotcha. Of course. Um, yeah, faithful imitation. Um, yeah, that's I don't feel super qualified to answer that question. I think I'm worried I'm gonna go and talk about things I don't really.
Most of the fun is in speculation, but it's also where most of the hesitancy happens.
Well, yeah. Well, I think I I go broad enough in general. Um, yeah, imitation. I think that might be a pass for me just
Okay,
because.
here's a way to rephrase it, because
Okay.
when we were talking over email about some of your recent work on belief, you were
Mm.
suggesting we could talk about nature and nurture influences. So
Oh
perhaps we
yeah.
could start with nurture, because that might include imitation among other things, because that's more social, and then we could head to the more internal nurture part or nature part.
Well, yeah. Well, basically, what I have been meaning with that in my recent research is that these cultural learning biases, social and cultural learning biases are the nurture side, whereas certain
Mhm,
cognitive biases could be all kinds of tendencies from personality to analytical thinking, whatever. So go we sort of been going through that already.
mhm,
Is imitation, I imagine, is influenced by social learning biases as other learning processes are, just like
mhm.
imitation. Um,
Uh-huh. Right. So then I guess the question is whether imitation itself is is like its own evolved phenomenon, as Hayes is arguing, or whether it's a byproduct of other things like this these more social cognitive biases, that for better or worse. So it's like whether you've genuinely evolved to imitate things you admire, or whether you've evolved to identify things you admire, um, or don't admire, and then you just modify your behavior as such. But imitation might not be the primary drive of that. It just might look like imitation.
Gosh, I don't know.
I don't know.
Um,
I so how about on the nature side then?
the way I think about the nature side is that we have evolved. So the biases that we have are like rules of thumb that the brain uses to get somewhere efficiently, right? So sometimes they work really well, and then other times, it doesn't fit so well anymore. Like the cheesecake example, I suppose. So like, really good to like fats because you make sure that you eat that when there is plenty, so you're safe when there's not. But now we've got too much of it, and
Mm-hmm.
that's not good for us. Um, or sugar, actually, a better example. Um, but what I find kind of interesting is that it's sort of that these things happen at this together with cultural evolution, right? So if our brain works in a certain way because of years of evolution, then now the cultural products that we have, so certain narratives, now fit that brain because those are the narratives that survive, right? In very much the same way as,
Right.
you know, biological evolution, which I find that really interesting. So they sort of work off each other.
Uh-huh.
That makes sense.
And then so that's also a chicken and egg problem, because it's like, are we constructing narratives that fit our heuristics, or are heuristics constructed out of the types of like reflective of the types of narratives that we've constructed over thousands of years or millions of years.
I guess we need the cognitive apparatus first to be able to construct a narrative in the first place.
Uh-huh.
Um,
Right. So
and I
there's
don't, yeah.
narratives, and then there's something sort of like intuitive physics. There's some famous developmental research on that, where it's like even babies sort of have an idea that something shouldn't just fall through a table or through a solid object. And you can kind of expand that more broadly, that even adults who aren't trained in physics probably have some theories for, like, how it rains or how tornadoes are formed. Even if they're wrong, it's probably going to be internally coherent. So there's the question of if we have that for every type of belief, even outside of like physical science.
I know we have like, or I know, from what I've understood, we have things like intuitive psychology as well,
Uh-huh.
intuitive biology. Where that comes from, whether that builds on things we've already learned, I'm not sure, again, because I'm not developmental. But I guess you could, intuitive psychology might follow from things that we just simply extrapolate from what we
Mm-hmm.
see around us. Yeah, where it starts, I don't know. That's a
Yeah. As well, so that's another interesting example where there's like these evolutionary forces that most of these intuitive beliefs that people construct are probably going to be wrong. But now and then, even if it's for the wrong reasons, one will be adaptive. And there seems to be an interplay with religion there too, like especially um, earlier religions with like these dietary restrictions, and maybe they say God doesn't want you to eat this particular food, and they think, and then when someone eats that food they get sick, and it's like, look, God is punishing you. And maybe all of that is sort of just capturing the fact that some particular food is more likely to carry diseases. So it's sort of an intuitive biology of that in a roundabout way.
yeah. I used to find that a really compelling explanation, but I actually read this last week that it was. I read some research that seemed to just debunk that
Mm-hmm.
it's not that the food spoiling and religious belief didn't hold that link. And I was so sad that, so
Mm-hmm.
I haven't read the debunking in detail, so maybe there's still hope. But I found that very sad because I found it very
Uh-huh.
intuitive.
Right. Yeah, that's so,
Mm.
so maybe if that is wrong, that's an example of intuitive psychology. So
Mhm.
would you be able to describe how that belief was debunked? You don't have to
No,
give any
no,
great
I
detail.
didn't try, and I really, it was probably a tweet to an article, and I still need to read it. Um, but yeah, I'm only just back to work, so I haven't really.
Uh-huh. Okay,
I
so
just
here's an example of the heuristic, which I'm not saying is a bad one, of
mm.
seeing an academic colleague publish something and then trusting their word for it without
Yeah.
reading the primary sources. And we probably wouldn't get nearly as far in science if we weren't able to do that, because every single day there's way too much for any one person to read.
Well, this is the thing. Everything go and we are moving fast ourselves as well. So if I could, I mean, this is my dream, right? To be able to focus on one topic and just staying there and really trying to read all of it. But then, I'm the what do you call it? The
Mm-hmm.
the captain of my ship, and I'm constantly staring at all kinds of
Uh-huh.
directions, so I can't help myself. But yeah, I don't know where I'm going
Uh-huh.
with this.
So another idea that I think was also Piaget is that when you're a child, you engage in imaginative play and you're exploring like almost everything you can for the idea of learning, and then gradually you discipline yourself because you don't want to be uh, like, potential is just potential, I guess. So you have to sort of narrow yourself into becoming something rather than existing in the possibility of everything. But then once you become a master, you sort of open up yourself to that idea of play again. Like through your newly informed worldview, you can look at things again in a new light. So it's sort of like this funnel idea. Like you start broad, but you don't know anything, and then you narrow, so you learn something, and then once you've developed enough expertise in a particular area, you can broaden out again with that knowledge in mind.
Yeah, there's a Picasso saying for that. Learn the rules like a pro, so you can break them like an artist.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Which is funny, which is exactly what he's done. Did you know that Pablo Picasso, before he did his famous, disfigured faces paintings and others, he actually used to paint really realistic paintings, just landscapes and that highly detailed, very, very skilled. But not that his later paintings aren't skilled, but like the opposite. But you wouldn't think of it as a Picasso because it's just a landscape or something like that. So he's done it himself in
Yeah.
that way.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It reminds me of another quote attributed to him. Someone goes up to him and asks him to draw a little sketch, and he does. And they said, "Can I keep it?" And he says, "No." And they're like, "What do you mean? It only took you 30 seconds." And he said, "No, it took me 60 years."
Oh yeah. Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. Good one.
Well, this has been very fun, Valerie. Thank you so much for your time and for sharing your research with us and for speculating with me.
Yeah, no worries. Yeah, it was good to do. Very speculative. Lots of disclaimers in my head. It's funny how we, don't want to be pinned down on a wrong idea. But like you said, it is some of the most fun parts of science to think about all the different ways things can go.
Yeah, I was attracted to your
So
research,
thank you.
how
Yeah,
broad the
that's fun.
focus is. So keep it up.